Self-esteem and its effects on criminal recidivism. In this investigation, I'm looking to see if there's a relationship between a person's level of positive self-esteem and their past criminal behavior, and whether or not this low self-esteem is a link or puts them at more risk for recidivism. Criminal recidivism is a problem for the United States of America. The Bureau of Justice Statistics found high rates in the U.S. among released prisoners. In the first 3 years after release, more than 2/3, or 68%, will reoffend or violate probation and be returned to incarceration. Within 6 years, 79% will return to incarceration. And before a decade is out, 83% of all released prisoners will return to incarceration in the United States of America. That is higher than most countries worldwide. Reincarceration is considered recidivism when probation is violated and officers determine that that person should be returned to incarceration based on that infraction, or a person who is on a supervised release or probation commits a new crime and is reconvicted. Self-esteem is defined as the feeling of having respect for yourself and your abilities, and having confidence and satisfaction with who you are and how you relate to the world around you. The effects of recidivism on our country are pretty high. First and foremost, recidivism reflects the effectiveness of the criminal justice system and whether its punitive and rehabilitative processes are working. With 83% of people reoffending within a decade, I would say that the punitive and rehabilitative process within our criminal justice system is not effective. The other effects of recidivism are higher incarceration rates with longer and harsher sentences. The more people that offend, the harder the justice system wants to treat them, thinking that this is the answer to defeat criminal behavior. We now have higher costs than ever in the criminal justice system, even though we're offering lower services to the inmates that are there. We have higher crime rates in our cities, which have negative effects on our society. The recidivism negatively impacts families and children because people who have already been in jail are going back to jail, and families are left not only supporting those inmates that are in jail, but also supporting the surrounding family of that inmate as well as their children. So oftentimes children not only have one but two parents in jail, and either they go through the public foster care system or they are raised by family or friends while the parent is incarcerated. This has an impact not only on current generations that are living with the absenteeism of their parents, but also on future generations. Because this population is getting bigger and bigger, the impact of broken families and parentless children is going to grow within our country. The United States of America leads the world in both incarceration and recidivism. And this is one of the biggest crises in the United States, although it is often undiscussed. Prisoner reentry is a problem, and how our nation and our justice system are executing this system is failing. So what is reentry, and how is reentry affected by somebody's self-esteem or how they feel about himself? Well, things that are beneficial to a person's self-esteem as well as to their reentry into society is their ability to complete a job application or a resume and get a job interview. If they're not feeling good about themselves or they have a different or a criminal view of themselves, their ability to fill out a job application, complete a resume, or get through a job interview with confidence is going to be difficult. Self-esteem plays a big factor in managing and maintaining personal relationships in a healthy way. It allows people to be productive, to have successes in education, to increase their opportunity, and to learn how to establish short and long-term goals. People who have positive or higher levels of self-esteem are able to nurture family relationships, give their children and their other family members the attention and the positive reinforcement that are needed. They're able to effectively manage their finances, balance a budget, live within their means. And they're going to be moving away from the criminal mindset and the labeling that they themselves have labeled themselves, as well as accepting what society has labeled them as a criminal. Some of the obstacles that we face and the damages to self-esteem that hurt reentry are substance abuse. Most criminal activity occurs while someone is under the influence of drugs or alcohol. A lot of people in the criminal justice system have an inability to establish and set goals and then enter into a pathway where they can achieve those goals. The criminal background search in the United States of America is at an all-time high, and this affects the ability to get a job or get a house if you have a criminal history. The public persona of a criminal is pretty negative, and the stigma that the public sees somebody with a criminal history follows them around and is very damning. Our justice system checks up on the employment of these individuals. It's a pain for the employer. It's embarrassing to the employee, calling them at work, calling their supervisor at work, seeing who answers the phone and just asking anybody at work if they have shown up for work that day. The ankle monitors, even with technology of Apple watches and dog chips, we still are requiring people with on criminal supervision to wear these large, bulky ankle monitors, even though technology is there for something that's far more discreet. So the purpose isn't probably just to monitor these people, but it is, social humiliation. And they have to go into the grocery store, doctor's offices, school appointments, uh, activities with their children at school, family events, and go to work every day with these big, huge ankle monitors on, announcing to the world and everybody who sees them of their criminal history. They have financial difficulties. They have an inability to get or apply for credit, and their medical needs and health insurance problems are pretty vast. All of these things are continued hiccups or hurdles that people who are trying to reenter society are facing, and they face this every single day, and it continues to damage their self-worth and their ability to go out into the world and survive within social norms. Torkelman et al. Completed a study titled The Effect of Transactional Analysis on the Self-Esteem of Imprisoned Women. It was a clinical trial. And basically they took a section of women in prison in Iran and measured their self-esteem and then went through the therapy process called transactional analysis to see if it was effective in increasing self-view and self-esteem, and if that increase would be important within their life with regards to positive progress, goal attainment, and success. This study confirmed that the majority of women who are incarcerated have low self-esteem, and that the factor of having low self-esteem was a contributor to their choices and their behavior that led them to the criminal justice system. It's important to note that this trial prefaced their work because of the understanding that people or women who have low self-esteem have trouble completing goals. And more than that, they have trouble even establishing goals because they have an identity or label that tells them already that they can't accomplish anything that's in alignment with social norms. Self-esteem is a very important factor to success in society, to societal norms for goal attainment and progression throughout the chapters in a person's life. Well, what this study did was focus on, first, can transactional analysis be used in a clinical environment to increase self-esteem? And would this increase their likelihood of success once they were released? So the clinical study separated women into intervention groups and control groups. Inmates were excluded if they didn't complete the questionnaire. They had to have at least an elementary level of education. They conducted the Rosenberg self-esteem test to measure a person's level of self-esteem. And then they conducted the transactional analysis training program over 8 sessions every week. And they did this through presentations, group meetings, group discussions, lectures, basically a class environment where these women were meeting on a regular basis with the research psychologists, assistants, and other nurses to walk them through this self-esteem training program. They had both a control group and they had an actual participation group. What they saw was that by going through transactional analysis training and focusing on really increasing the self-esteem of these individuals was highly effective. The study used 100% of the population of a women's prison in Iran. It was a clinical study, and it was very effective in determining the results that self-esteem is a factor in criminal identity and criminal behavior, and that by applying transactional analysis therapy to prison population of women, the level of self-esteem could be increased, and it effectively reduces the likelihood that they're going to repeat the behavior that endangered the stability of their family and themselves. So basically, the conclusion of this study of women who were imprisoned in Iran concluded that women in prison have low self-esteem by majority, and that events in prison and that led up to them being in prison continue to damage self-esteem. And that unless the self-esteem is arrested, or the continual damage to self-esteem is arrested, and actually there's a focus on building up the damaged self-esteem so that the personal identity and the labeling that they have of themselves changes. Unless that changes, then they were at a high risk to recidivate when they were released. But if through self-esteem transactional analysis training, a person's self-identity and esteem could be healed or changed, it effectively lowered their risk for recidivism by lowering the risk that they were going to make the same choices they made before while they were feeling poorly about their abilities and their relationship to society and about themselves. Now they would make better choices because they felt better about themselves and their ability to accomplish goals that they set for themselves. They concluded that transactional analysis therapy can improve self-esteem for individuals who are incarcerated, and that increased levels of self-esteem will reduce the risk of recidivism. Why? Because self-esteem helps people feel capable of living in the world, solving the problems, participating in societal normal functions, which most criminal behaviors are the result of adopting attitudes that are anti-social. The next study, conducted by Thapa et al., Thapa, Brown, and Skilling, was the relationship between self-esteem, gender, criminal attitudes, and recidivism in youth justice. The study tested both males and females, and it reviewed the risk-need responsitivity model where criminal attitudes are the focus. And the hypothesis was that self-esteem plays a significant role in criminal attitudes of youth offenders and then their recidivism. So 300 youth offenders were used for this study. 2/3 were male, a third were female. And contrary to the hypothesis, self-esteem only played a role for the female youth offenders. And for the female offenders, the factor of self-esteem was pretty significant in the behaviors that got them incarcerated. And there have been a lot of studies regarding self-esteem and criminal conduct surrounding delinquency and aggression and behavior that is against social norms and how it links to low self-esteem. And there's a lot of contradiction on whether or not there is a link between delinquency and low self-esteem. And although this study didn't find the link in male individuals, it did find a significant link in female offenders. Risk-need recidivism is a model that comes from personality and cognitive social learning theory and how it relates to criminal conduct. And it predicts that there is a link between low self-esteem and criminal behavior, and that link between criminal behavior or delinquency and low self-esteem is parallel. The results showed that females were far more prone to have self-esteem problems and that these problems were related to their criminal behavior. And it showed that these female offenders would highly benefit from therapy and education to increase their self-esteem. And if their self-esteem levels were increased, that this would indeed help them make better choices. That therapy would help them to increase their self-view and their self-worth perspectives, and that they would make better choices for themselves and their families. So although gender hadn't been a factor in previous studies, it was pretty surprising to the researchers and to me that the difference was so vast in male versus female offenders. The study used empirical statistical methods, and it was completed with observation using students of psychology. The results of this study indicate that the populations of offenders need to be studied and treated separately, as they may be vastly different from one another, and that population meaning male and female. Women and teenage girls specifically tend to have lower levels of self-esteem when compared to that of men, and criminal behavior and attitudes could be very different and have different motivations for males versus females. Women do have more external issues with low self-esteem than men, and there is a need for more research with regards to women inmates, since the population of women in prison is increasing exponentially. It is possible that this could be related to problems that youth are having in their social role and their social identity in this electronic age. The limitations of this study are the small population and the limited amount of lifespan that is covered by the investigation. It would be beneficial for the study to incorporate a larger population of youth over many different cultures and track these individuals over a longer period of time. This next study by Mbach and AB, Metzke, Betzler, and Steinhausen focused on internalizing and externalizing problems, including depression and self-esteem, in male juvenile offenders. The hypothesis of this study was if incarceration increases the levels of depression, decreases self-esteem, and increases symptoms of other mental health disorders or psychoses. In this study, the detainment of juveniles is compared with the non-detainment of juveniles prior to court appearances to determine if detainment has an effect on the mental stability, mental disorders, depression, and self-esteem of these individuals. It wasn't clear prior to the study whether or not incarceration had an impact on the juveniles prior to court. So it went over and looked at 125 males. They were ages 11 to 19, and this was done in a psychiatric clinic study. The subjects participated by completing questionnaires. And the purpose of the study was to see if juveniles who were charged with cases were displaying behavioral mental health symptoms because they were detained, or if these symptoms were part of the majority of the population of criminal offenders who are juveniles. The study postulated that if an individual has low self-esteem, it increased their risk for delinquency. And it used a community control group of 125 males as well in the testing. The self-esteem test that was used was also the Rosenberg self-esteem evaluation. And the results showed that non-detained youth offenders have higher rates of depression and lower self-esteem than the community-based control group. The highest mental health concern in this study was the implied correlation between delinquency and depression. The majority of the juvenile offenders scored as having major depressive disorders, and these disorders had been undiagnosed and untreated. The more severe the criminal charges were against these individuals, the more severe the mental orders or disruptions in psychopathology. It was a good study which investigated the mental health correlation with juvenile criminal behavior, noting that detained juveniles had been studied, but offenders who hadn't been detained had been left out of the study. So it was able to determine if there was similar pathology between criminal offenders in the juvenile courts, whether they were detained or not. The study showed there's no correlation whether someone is detained or not, but that somebody who is making the choice of delinquency, there is a correlation in their state of mind with depression, low self-esteem, and other mental health disorders, and that was the commonality amongst these juvenile offenders. The conclusion of this study was that the majority of juvenile offenders have high depression, low self-esteem, and most have other mental disorders which contribute to their criminal attitude or criminal identity. Their social associations, meaning their friends that they are around, and the life choices or criminal behavior choices that they're making. It also noted that incarceration doesn't help these mental health symptoms, but in many cases, and almost 100%, may aggravate or increase the mental disorders that these juveniles are dealing with. Incarceration increased depression. Incarceration decreased esteem levels. And in many cases, mental health disorders were hard to detect as far as the extremity of how the levels increased because those offenders were then so highly medicated within the system for the other psychopathology. The results were as predicted when compared with the community cohort. However, there was a difference when comparing the detained juveniles against the non-detained juveniles. There wasn't a difference. It was only within comparing both of those groups within the community cohort. The study also showed that low self-esteem is an indicator of criminal behavior, as both juvenile offender groups, the detained group and the non-detained group, have lower self-esteem in comparison with the community control group. The study was an excellent study for the research question and topic of how self-esteem relates to recidivism, because it shows the correlation between self-esteem and other mental health disorders to criminal behavior in juvenile offenders. And as I understand this study, the detention was not a factor in contributing to the mental health of the juvenile, so much as the mental health of the juvenile was a predictor of the criminal behavior. One of these mental health issues is low self-esteem and how the individual fits into the social roles based on their socioeconomic status or academic achievement. This information is excellent in presenting the necessity for self-esteem intervention with school-aged children in order to prevent the trajectory for criminal behavior. Boduzak et al. Completed a study titled Criminal Social Identity of Recidivistic Prisoners and the Role of Self-Esteem, Family, and Criminal Friends. The study looks at the role of self-esteem in the development of a social identity and how this social identity relates to criminal behavior. It uses social identity theory in reference to self-esteem and investigates aspects of individual lives in the areas of relationships with friends, positive and negative self-esteem, and group ties to identify the pathway to criminal identification. The study investigates the role of self-esteem in the development of social identity and how this relates to criminal behavior. And this study also used Rosenberg's self-esteem scale. The research was conducted in a prison setting, and the researchers share that criminal social identity infers a rejection of societal norms, and that the pathway shows a preference with the individuals to antisocial norms. The study specifically targeted a prison population of those who have already recidivated. The average age of the population in the study was 33, and a total of 312 subjects were included in the study. A variety of tests were used, including the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, measure of criminal attitudes and associates, a 7-item inventory of peer rejection, a personal information questionnaire, a recidivism and demographic questionnaire, and other evaluation tools. And it was collected with the inmates going to regularly scheduled education classes over a 6-month period of time. The prisoners completed the data using a booklet with pencils. A measurement of criminal social identity and self-esteem was constructed. And the study suggests that criminal identity is associated with criminal relationships or friends, and it may have a direct correlation with parental absenteeism during early childhood development. The limitations in the study sampling were that the people had already recidivated and they were all violent criminals. The study indicates that another study might be necessary or further research in populations like white-collar criminals, sex offenders, and female offenders, and youth. The researchers state that this empirical research supports social identity theory and that self-esteem plays a dramatic part in what role or what behaviors are acted upon, most notably criminal behaviors. The limitation of the study was discussed in the results that the population of inmates displayed poor attention spans. They were not well educated and had difficulty with their reading and writing skills. It might be a significant problem in the study because the written work wasn't followed up on with interviews, so there might be a lack of quality information. The study didn't measure if higher self-esteem would have reduced recidivism, and potentially a follow-up test could have been done later to determine if the population continued in their criminal identity and behavior. The empirical research of this study supports social identity theory, and that self-esteem plays a big role in what behaviors are acted upon. In this case, it wasn't clear to me whether the levels of self-esteem were high or low within the population. That would be good data to accumulate since all the population had recidivated. The study was thorough in its tests that were administered to the entire population. However, the potential for error in the data that was collected was pretty high given the education and learning disabilities of the population. And because the researchers didn't follow up verbally with the written work of those who completed the studies, there may have been problems with the questionnaire booklet. It did an excellent job of investigating and correlating the details of social identity theory, and the population showed a need to maintain a positive relationship with the criminal relations they had established in order to maintain their self-view and their self-esteem. The study of Asensio, self-esteem, reflected appraisals and self-views, examining criminal and worker identities, was really remarkable in the fact that it looked at how self-views of others are reaffirmed through appraisals and how they're rejected by individuals when those who are offering the appraisals are not valued by the individual. The research study was conducted in order to test the moderating effect self-esteem has in forming self-views and notate the conclusions of self when feedback inconsistent with self-views is received. The study uses the influence of identity control theory and research that has been conducted on self-esteem. Surveys were used in the study solely from incarcerated persons. Self-esteem is a regular component of self-worth and whether or not a person feels that they are capable in the views of society. This is the case with identity theory, according to this study. When identity is confirmed, a person's feelings of value or self-worth increase. When this is not the case, a person's value decreases. One hypothesis of this study is that when people hear from others who are considered significant personal relationships, as appraisals are more consistent with how a person views themselves if they have high self-esteem, as opposed to those who have low self-esteem. The term that is used for what people hear from others is reflected appraisals. Using incarcerated persons, the research suggests that limited exposure to outside influences other than those within the institution, and that these interactions with other inmates and with prison staff will have an impact on self-esteem and self-view and criminal identity. A second hypothesis for the study in relation to the interaction of staff personnel and the inmate is that reflected appraisals will have the opposite effect as in the first hypothesis. For those with high self-esteem, what is reflected from the prison staff will be less consistent than what an inmate holds as a self-view. Based on the findings of these first two hypotheses, a third hypothesis is that self-esteem will be more in alignment with the reflected appraisals one has from significant others and not those of the prison staff. The methods for data collection were interviewing the inmates at a correction facility, and 171 male and female offenders participated in the interview process. The interviews were collected over a long period of time in the course of a year. The results showed that inmates with higher self-esteem gave greater importance or listened more to reflected appraisals that aligned with their own self-views. People in this population may not want to associate with other people who have a different opinion of them than they feel about themselves. Basically, inmates exhibited behavior where people were cut off if they didn't provide verifying feedback. The study states that it may be of interest for institutions in the criminal justice system to implement rehabilitative therapy that is not provided by prison staff, since the study appears to show that inmates do not qualify the opinions of staff as accurate reflections. Almost 200 inmates were questioned and interviewed. The methods and analysis performed by the researchers in the study were thorough and studied two identity associations, one as criminal and one as worker. This was important due to the context of the study and the fact that the questions about different relationship types were included in the study. Overall, the study discussed whether or not self-view and self-esteem as it related to the education and rehabilitation in the system was evaluated appropriately, and whether the treatment that was applied was effective. The results of this study make sense and could make a difference if applied in rehabilitation efforts in institutions. The study was solely focused on the association of self-esteem and self-view and how it related to the reflective appraisals of others. Whether incarceration or societal views about formerly incarcerated person damages self-esteem is an important ingredient to determine if low self-esteem is a determinant for recidivism. The study indicated that there are some self-serving biases that inmates may have in order to maintain their self-worth or self-view. This attributional error enables the person to protect themselves from negative reflection appraisals they may receive from people who are not their significant others or peers. However, as this study indicated, this does not help a person re-enter society and develop a better self-view away from a criminal identity. Since they may discount any information that a prison staff attempted to impart to them through rehabilitation or education classes, the likelihood that they return to life and self-view they had prior to incarceration is very high. Though they may reflect a higher view of themselves, this may be a defense or protection mechanism that increases the risk of recidivism. The study is beneficial research to answer my question if self-esteem is a factor in criminal recidivism. Overall, the research studies outlined here agree that self-esteem is a link to how one views themselves, based on societal expectations and societal norms. When we fall below these expectations, and we're not measuring up to what we thought or think society desires, it can lead to low self-esteem or low self-worth. What is reflected to us by others, that's how we value ourselves. It's also how we think others value us. So we choose relationships, activities, and lifestyles that reinforce our self-worth. And this is how we end up with criminal behavior or criminal identity. Because in that group of people, What's affirmed back to us, those appraisals, give us value because we meet those expectations. We're living up to that norm within that anti-social normality. So could low self-esteem be related to recidivism and continuing criminal behavior? Based on the 5 studies that we looked at here, the answer is yes. Low self-esteem is related to criminal behavior and continued criminal behavior. Low self-esteem is related to the behaviors and the choices that someone makes in the first place that cause them to become incarcerated. And if that factor of low self-esteem is not arrested or abated, then it remains a factor for the choices that a person makes and the appraisals that they seek when they are released from incarceration. Factors that contribute to self-esteem are socioeconomic status, academic performance, self-view reinforcement, peer or social relations, independent living and problem-solving ability, the availability of resources, the skill of establishing and then achieving goals, and historically in our childhood, if there was parental absenteeism. If we are able to establish some new events to increase self-esteem within these building blocks, we're able to lower the risk of recidivism. To have academic events that are successful, to introduce and practice life skills to enable independent living and problem solving, to learn how to set reasonable goals for ourselves, short term and long term, and begin achieving them. Slowly changes our self-view. And as we continue in academic successes, solving problems and living independently, and achieving short-term goals, we are reinforcing a new self-view. If we are able to establish new peer and social relations and establish new resources that are available to ourselves, we continue with that self-view reinforcement. Over time, this begins to change our socioeconomic status and our self-esteem improves. These factors, if they are continually reinforced through a rehabilitation process, could increase self-esteem and thereby lower the risk of recidivism, as well as change the identity of I am a criminal to I am a productive person who's able and capable of achieving my goals. These 5 studies reinforced that low self-esteem and criminal identity contributes to criminal behavior, and that having programs while incarcerated to increase self-esteem reduces the risk of continued criminal behavior resulting in recidivism. Reinforced criminal identity and self-view contributes to an ongoing self-perception or identity to see the self as criminal. Society increases these obstacles, it reaffirms the criminal self-view and criminal identity, thereby increasing the risk of recidivism. Currently, the Department of Justice and society enhances low self-esteem by maintaining difficult employment standards through background checks for nonviolent and non-sexual offenders. These criminal background checks are on most employment applications, as well as for housing and banking, constantly reinforcing the criminal identity and putting up roadblocks for goal achievement, independent living, and changing in socioeconomic status. Special requirements are also often required in establishing financial accounts. There is a continued public and employer bias against persons with prior offenses, which continues in lowering or damaging self-esteem of those who have criminal history. Society also excludes those from various activities if there is a criminal history, and there is continued disenfranchisement by our justice system. In the world of the internet search history is also a problem because private citizens, as well as employers, can search social media and other internet search engines in order to see what is out there for each individual who is trying to make a change for themselves in their lives. Large ankle monitors, employer check-ins, employer evaluations with probation and halfway house officers over and over and over again also reinforce the criminal identity and bias that others have, continuing to damage and lower self-esteem, and continuing to increase the risk for this group, this population, for recidivism. Overall, the results that I have seen in this analysis of studies performed in the relationship of low self-esteem and recidivism shows that low self-esteem can result in poor choices that result in criminal behavior. These choices continually reinforce a criminal identity. Social connections that are made to continue to reaffirm a criminal identity also reaffirm a poor self-view. Other factors that encourage low self-esteem are low performance in academic or school arenas, difficulty in maintaining positive or gainful employment, and life skill struggles such as the inability to set goals and then achieve them, either short or long-term goals. Because of the difficulty in academia, in gainful employment, and in understanding how to set and achieve goals, an alternate pathway of survival is necessary, and this is outside societal norms. The choices that are made in order to survive result most often in criminal activity and continual reinforcement of criminal identity. This cycle repeats over and over again, damaging self-esteem and creating an alternate identity for the individual. But what these 5 studies have in common and what they show in different hypotheses and therapies is that positive self-esteem therapy can change the trajectory of a criminal pathway. Change in self-view can help to allow over time an acceptance of social norms. Little bits of success in events in education establishes a successful path and successful history. Receiving appraisals from different social networks of people like contract education workers or therapists that are outside of the prison staff begin to increase the likelihood that these appraisals will be accepted by the individual and could move towards changing the identity of self as to someone who can achieve academically and someone who can have successes within the boundaries of societal norms. Establishing life skills for finances and goals and life management within this type of training and structure also begins to change the way a person sees themselves and what their capabilities are. Group sessions affirming new social identity could also increase positive self-esteem. And through my analysis of these 5 studies, it is also very apparent that the identification of criminal is or weighs heavily on the choices a person makes because of how they see themselves. And they're reaffirming that in what they can do within society as well as who they associate with. So if the labeling changes and the structure in which society interacts with these people changes their persona definition from criminal identity to person in society who's successful and who's meeting their goals and opportunities, slowly the self-view changes and begins to move and operate within societal norms. So discontinuing the reference within the prison population as a criminal or as an inmate could be huge if we start referencing them as residents. That could have a huge impact because they're no longer labeled in a mindset that they've also identified themselves with. These studies have shown that ongoing positive self-esteem reinforcement that is constructive will create better self-images and higher levels of self-esteem, and that this will reduce criminal recidivism. Increased experience and appraisals from others that reflect successes within societal norms will give people a higher self-worth within societal norms and allow them to make choices that are not antisocial. Increased view of what the self is capable of and accomplishing based on input from the outside that is not from criminal associates, that is not from prison staff, but other people within society will continue the process of making better choices. The reflection of self-worth that they see from others will include people within normal society. Good work effort, setting goals based on reinforced appraisals will result in higher self-esteem, and the self-view will change. The criminal identity will change, and beginning to see themselves as capable of operating within the norms of society, of having a job, of being successful at managing a budget, of possibly taking classes and being able to get good grades will change the view of self and what self is capable of. When a person is accomplished in setting goals and begins to see goals slowly achieved, they become optimistic about their future within the normal setting of society. As self-worth increases and the view of self begins to see something other than criminal, but maybe see a hard worker, a trained and educated employee, a mother, a family member, a good friend, and someone who can accomplish goals. This increases self-worth, changes self-view, and a person who has higher self-esteem continues in the pathway of gathering increased experience and positive appraisals that reflect successes with societal norms. And if this pathway continues over and over and over again, it reinforces normal behavior and decreases criminal identity. The limitations of the literature in this investigation are that small populations were studied, usually by interview or survey, and over a very small period of time. A large population study wasn't completed, which gathered data specifically about how increased self-esteem would lower criminal behavior or recidivism. Ideally, a study would have to include a large population of offenders that were determined to have low self-esteem, provide them with ongoing self-esteem therapy prior to release from incarceration and then ongoing afterwards, and then measure the rate of recidivism over at least a 10-year period of time. In this investigation, the 5 studies used had different hypotheses, and not all the data was measured using the same methods. Overall, after reviewing the 5 studies in this investigation, looking at the majority of the population in each study who were determined to have low self-esteem, as well as other mental health issues, including depressive disorders. This is a factor in criminal behavior. Low self-esteem continues to be damaged through the process of the criminal justice system, including incarceration. Therapy or education classes that are offered within the institutions that provide appraisals to inmates from the staff of prisons are by and large ineffective and are discarded by the inmates. Therefore, the inmate population would benefit from self-esteem therapy in order to reduce the likelihood that they will have the need to continue in their criminal behavior upon release.